They thought murdering our allies would make us kneel. Instead, they taught 8 billion humans what total war really means. In the year 2387, humanity had finally earned its place among the stars. After 2 centuries of blood, sweat, and determination, Earth's colonies stretched across 17 star systems. We weren't the strongest species in the galaxy, weren't the smartest, and sure as hell weren't the most advanced. But we had something most alien races had forgotten over their millennia of existence. We remembered what it meant to fight for what's right. The Galactic Council ruled from their crystal spires on Nexus Prime, a collection of 12 ancient species who believed they owned the universe. The Zephyrians, with their crystalline bodies and superiority complexes, looked down on carbon-based life as primitive accidents. The Korath Empire, with their 6 arms and even bigger egos, saw warfare as an art form, complete with elaborate rules and ceremonies that turned battles into deadly ballets. The Thessian Collective, those jellyfish-looking bastards who floated in their atmospheric suits, thought emotion was a disease to be cured through surgical precision and cold logic. Then there were the Nexari, silicon-based beings who viewed time in geological scales and considered anything that lived less than 1,000 years to be mayflies. The Vorthak Consortium operated as a hive mind, making decisions through consensus that could take decades to reach. The Helian Empire believed in genetic purity so fervently they'd sterilized 17 worlds, rather than allow inferior species to contaminate their territories. Each council member brought their own brand of arrogance, their own flavor of cosmic condescension, but they all agreed on one fundamental truth: the galaxy belonged to the old powers, and newcomers should know their place. But there was one species the council feared above all others. Not humanity, not yet anyway. It was the Valorans of Kepler 442b, a warrior race with honor codes that made ancient samurai look like playground bullies. Standing 7 feet tall with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that burned like miniature suns, they were the galaxy's conscience. Their homeworld was a fortress paradise, where crystal cities rose from volcanic plains and their children learned philosophy alongside swordsmanship. Every Valoran was both scholar and warrior, diplomat and guardian, artist and protector. When the council voted to strip mining rights from primitive worlds whose inhabitants couldn't defend themselves, the Valorans said no. When they decided to relocate inconvenient populations to make room for profitable ventures, the Valorans stood in their way. When slave traders operated with council-issued licenses, claiming they were providing employment opportunities, the Valorans hunted them down like the animals they were. For 3 millennia, the Valorans had served as the galaxy's unofficial police force, the ones who stepped in when the powerful preyed on the weak, and when humanity first stumbled into galactic politics like a drunk cowboy into a tea party, it was the Valorans who vouched for us. Ambassador Kethavar Ironspirit himself had stood before the council and declared that humans possessed what he called the fire of justice, a willingness to fight not for conquest or profit, but for principle. The council had laughed at first, these ancient beings who'd forgotten what passion felt like. But Kethavar had been insistent, and his people commanded too much respect to be ignored entirely. The alliance between humanity and the Valorans hadn't been planned or negotiated through diplomatic channels. It had been forged in blood during the Rigel incident, when human colonists found themselves caught between council-backed corporate raiders and local pirates. The raiders had legal documentation, proper permits, and the full backing of galactic law to seize the colony for administrative restructuring. The pirates just wanted to kill everyone and take their stuff. Both groups expected the colonists to either submit or die quietly. Instead, Captain Maria Santos of the merchant vessel Defiant Spirit had sent a single message to the nearest Valoran patrol: "They're murdering families. Send help or send prayers." The Valoran response had been swift and decisive. 3 dreadnoughts appeared within hours, not to negotiate or mediate, but to eliminate threats to innocent life. The battle lasted 6 minutes. The aftermath lasted 6 months, as council lawyers tried to prosecute the Valorans for unauthorized military intervention, and found themselves facing a species that considered the protection of the innocent to be more sacred than any law. From that day forward, Humanity and the Valorans had been unofficial allies. We shared intelligence, coordinated patrol routes, and most importantly, we shared values. Both species believed that might without right was just organized bullying. Both cultures produced individuals willing to die before they'd kneel to tyrants. Both peoples understood that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to be very, very good at war. The friendship had grown stronger over the decades. Human engineers worked alongside Valoran craftsmen to design ships that were both beautiful and deadly. Valoran philosophers debated ethics with human poets, finding common ground in the belief that civilization meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Joint missions became common, with human adaptability complementing Valoran honor, human innovation supporting Valoran tradition. But the Council saw this alliance as a threat to their carefully maintained order. Two species who refused to bow, who inspired others to stand up, who made younger races believe they had rights worth fighting for. This was dangerous thinking in a galaxy where stability depended on everyone knowing their place. The Valorans alone had been manageable, contained by their rigid honor codes and reluctance to strike first. Humans alone were insignificant, too few and too new to matter. But together, they represented something the Council couldn't tolerate. The idea that justice might matter more than authority, that right might triumph over might, that the galaxy's future didn't belong exclusively to its ancient masters. The Festival of Unity happened once every 7 years on Valoran Prime, a celebration so sacred that even their enemies had historically respected it. Every ship in their fleet would return home, weapon systems deactivated as per their ancient traditions. Families reunited. Warriors became fathers, mothers, children for one precious week. The planet transformed from a military fortress into something approaching paradise, as crystal cities filled with laughter and the sounds of celebration echoed across volcanic plains. Children who had grown up on distant outposts met grandparents for the first time. Veterans shared war stories that gradually became lessons in honor and sacrifice. Artists displayed works created in the depths of space, inspired by alien sunsets and the vast beauty of the void. The entire species came together to remember who they were beneath their armor, what they fought to protect, why their sacrifices mattered. It was their most human moment, ironically enough. The time when the galaxy's greatest warriors allowed themselves to simply be people. The Council knew this. They'd known it for centuries. They had detailed intelligence reports on every aspect of Valoran culture, including the precise timing and protocols of their sacred festival. They knew that during Unity Week, the Valoran fleet would be completely vulnerable, their mighty dreadnoughts as defenseless as civilian pleasure craft. They knew that attacking during this time would be considered the deepest possible violation of galactic law and custom. And they chose that moment to strike. The attack came without warning, without declaration, without any of the ceremonial challenges that supposedly civilized species use to justify warfare. At Oro 300 hours, Valoran Standard Time, while most of the population slept peacefully in their homes, Council strike forces materialized throughout the system. Not just the usual suspects. This was a coordinated effort involving 9 of the 12 Council races, the largest military operation in galactic history. Zephyrian crystalline warships, their faceted hulls reflecting the light of Valoran's binary suns, opened fire first. Their quantum disruptors, weapons capable of unmaking matter at the subatomic level, turned proud dreadnoughts into expanding clouds of elementary particles. The Korath Empire's hexagonal battle wagons followed, their plasma cannons designed more for spectacle than efficiency, creating mushroom clouds that could be seen from orbit as they incinerated spaceports and defense installations. Thessian Collective, vessels, their organic hulls pulsing with bioluminescent weapon systems, targeted population centers with surgical precision. These weren't random attacks. They were systematic extermination, each strike calculated to cause maximum casualties while minimizing damage to valuable infrastructure. The jellyfish things had run the numbers, determined exactly how to commit genocide while preserving real estate values. 37 dreadnoughts destroyed in the first hour, their crews never having a chance to reach battle stations. 143 cruisers vaporized while their captains were still trying to understand what was happening. Over 400 smaller vessels, scouts, transports, patrol boats, training ships full of cadets, eliminated with the casual efficiency of an exterminator dealing with insects. But ships were just metal and plasma. The real target, the real horror, was planetside. 47 million Valorans lived on their homeworld, from ancient veterans who remembered the early days of galactic civilization, to children born under foreign stars who had come home for their first festival. The Council's ground assault was designed not just to kill, but to break the spirit of any survivors. Kinetic bombardment from orbit shattered the crystal cities, their beautiful architecture reduced to glittering sand that caught the light like tears. Nerve gas deployed in residential districts ensured that families died together, parents and children holding each other as their nervous systems shut down. Plasma bombs ignited the ceremonial gardens where couples had been married for millennia, where children played games passed down through generations, where poets recited verses about honor and sacrifice under alien constellations. The Council forces didn't just kill, they desecrated. Ancient monuments to Valoran heroes were targeted specifically, reduced to rubble not for tactical reasons but to erase history itself. Libraries containing 3,000 years of philosophy, poetry, and wisdom were incinerated with thermite. Charges. Even the traditional burial grounds weren't spared. Orbital strikes cracking open crypts and scattering the honored dead across the landscape. 6 hours. That's how long it took for the galaxy's conscience to be murdered in its sleep. 6 hours to destroy a civilization that had spent millennia standing between the weak and the powerful, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, proving that might without right was just another form of tyranny. 6 hours to eliminate the one species that had consistently reminded the galaxy what it meant to have honor. The few survivors were left deliberately alive, witnesses to the Council's power and examples of what happened to those who challenged established order. Broken, traumatized, scattered across a dozen refugee camps, they served as living reminders that even the mightiest could fall if they forgot their place. The Council made sure their story spread, whispered through back channels and underground networks, a cautionary tale about the price of defiance. When the attack was over, Council forces withdrew as systematically as they'd arrived, leaving behind a dead world and 47 million corpses. The binary suns still rose over Valoran, prime, but they illuminated only ruins and graves, silence and ash. The species that had served as the galaxy's moral compass for 3 millennia had been reduced to scattered survivors and smoking craters, their homeworld transformed from paradise to monument to the Council's absolute authority. The Council's official announcement came 3 days after the massacre, broadcast simultaneously across every inhabited system in the galaxy, transmitted in 4,000 languages, delivered through every communication network from primitive radio signals to quantum entanglement arrays. The message reached every corner of civilized space within hours. The tone was clinical, administrative, as emotionless as a weather report or a shipping manifest. High Counselor Zeth Kara, the Zephyrian representative whose crystalline form hadn't shown a single crack of emotion in 3 centuries of public service, addressed the galaxy with the same inflection she might use to announce lunch menu changes. The Valoran hegemony has been designated as a Class 7 threat to galactic stability, she began, her translated words carrying none of the harmonic overtones that gave Zephyrian speech its musical quality. Their continued interference in Council affairs, their primitive attachment to concepts of honor and justice, and their recent alliance with the human upstarts necessitated immediate protective action. Protective action. That's what they called it. Not genocide, not murder, not the systematic extermination of an entire civilization, but protective action, as if the Council had been defending itself against unprovoked aggression. The Orwellian doublespeak would have been laughable if it wasn't being used to justify 47 million corpses. The justification continued with the bloodless precision of a legal brief. Thessian collective speaker Velthara, a creature that resembled a jellyfish crossed with a computer terminal, provided what they called contextual analysis of the situation. Its synthetic voice, generated by translation algorithms because its natural communication involved bioluminescent patterns, explained that psychological profiles of human leadership suggested elevated stress responses and irrational decision-making patterns. The removal of their primary alien ally would force them to accept council authority through logical necessity rather than emotional rebellion. They thought they understood us. The council's xenobiologists had studied human behavior for decades, cataloged our responses, predicted our reactions like we were lab rats in a maze. They'd analyzed our history, from the tribal conflicts of our prehistoric ancestors to the corporate wars of the early space age. They'd noted our tendency toward emotional decision-making, our attachment to abstract concepts like justice and freedom, our irrational willingness to fight against impossible odds when our principles were threatened. Their computers had run millions of simulations, calculating probability matrices that took into account every variable they could identify: human population growth rates, industrial capacity, technological development, political unity, all fed into algorithms designed to predict how we'd respond to the loss of our only major ally. The consensus among council strategists was unanimous. Humans were apex predators from a death world. Yes, but they lacked the numbers, the technology, and the industrial capacity to challenge council authority directly. Korath Battlelord Thexnox, a six-armed giant whose species had conquered half a sector through sheer bloody-minded determination, provided the military assessment with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a war. His people had been fighting for sport since before humanity discovered fire, and their battle records were legendary throughout the galaxy. Human emotional attachment to the Valorans is quaint, he declared, the translation software struggling to convey his species' complex mix of contempt and amusement. But emotions do not destroy starships. Passion does not penetrate deflector shields. Honor does not overcome superior firepower. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Earth's 17. Systems against the Council's 4,000. Humanity's 800 ships, most of them converted merchant vessels or obsolete patrol boats, against the Council's 50,000 dedicated warships. Our primitive fusion drives, barely capable of achieving significant fractions of light speed, against their quantum displacement engines that could cross the galaxy in weeks. Our kinetic weapons and nuclear warheads against their exotic matter cannons and reality distortion bombs. On paper, we were less than a rounding error in their calculations. The Council's war computers estimated that a direct military confrontation would last approximately 6 hours, coincidentally the same amount of time it had taken them to destroy the Valorans. Humanity would either surrender immediately upon receiving an ultimatum, or be crushed so quickly that news of the war's beginning and end would reach distant systems in the same transmission. But the Council's analysis went beyond mere military considerations. They'd studied our psychology, our sociology, our entire cultural development, with the thoroughness of entomologists examining a particularly interesting species of insect. They noted our pack-bonding behavior, our tendency to form emotional attachments that transcended rational self-interest. They observed our historical patterns of response to trauma, the way human societies could be shocked into compliance through sufficient application of overwhelming force. The Valoran massacre wasn't just about eliminating a threat, it was about sending a message. The Council wanted humanity to see what happened to species that forgot their place in the galactic hierarchy. They wanted us to understand that friendship with rebels carried a price, that standing up to authority had consequences, that our primitive notions of justice and fair play were luxuries we couldn't afford if we wanted to survive. Most importantly, they wanted us to despair. The Council's xenopsychologists had identified hope as humanity's greatest strength and greatest weakness. We were a species that could endure almost any hardship as long as we believed things could get better, that could fight against impossible odds as long as we had something worth fighting for. But remove that hope. Crush our spirits as thoroughly as they'd crushed our allies, and we'd fold like every other species that had ever challenged the established order. The message concluded with what amounted to a formal ultimatum, though it was phrased in the diplomatic language favored by civilized species. Humanity had 30 standard days to formally acknowledge Council authority. accept junior membership status in the galactic community, and demonstrate our understanding of proper hierarchical relationships by surrendering our military forces and submitting to council oversight of our expansion efforts. In other words, kneel or die. President Elena Vasquez called an emergency session of the United Earth Congress within hours of receiving the council's ultimatum. Representatives from every colony, every station, every ship in the void participated via quantum relay, their holographic images filling the vast chamber beneath Luna City. The debate lasted 14 hours, with voices raised in anger, fear, and desperate determination as humanity grappled with the most important decision in our species' history. Senator Jackson Hayes, representing the outer colonies where families had fled Earth's overcrowding and corporate wars, spoke for many when he laid out the stark reality of their situation. Mr. President, we're talking about species that have been waging war since before Earth's continents took their current shape. They have weapons that can crack planets, fleets that darken entire solar systems. The Valorans were warriors born and bred, and look what happened to them. What exactly can we do against that kind of power? His words carried the weight of simple arithmetic. 47 million Valorans, a species that had perfected the art of warfare over 3 millennia, had been slaughtered like livestock. Humanity barely numbered 8 billion across all our colonies, and most of us were civilians. Farmers, miners, researchers, traders, people who'd never seen combat outside of history books and entertainment programs. How could shopkeepers and teachers stand against the forces that had crushed the galaxy's greatest warriors? But General Patricia Hawkins, representing Earth's Joint Chiefs of Staff, saw the situation differently. A veteran of the corporate wars and the Martian independence conflict, she'd spent her career fighting against superior forces and winning through adaptation and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. "Senator, with respect, you're thinking like a politician instead of a predator," she said, her scarred face reflecting decades of hard choices and harder victories. "The Council has overwhelming firepower, yes, but they're used to facing opponents who follow the same rules they do. Formal declarations of war, massive fleet engagements, territorial conquest, honor guards, and surrender ceremonies. They've been playing the same game for millennia." The general activated a tactical display showing the galaxy's political and military situation, thousands of systems glowing in different colors to represent various allegiances and threat levels. Council territories formed a vast web of interconnected power, their supply lines and communication networks spanning light years. "Look at this," she continued, highlighting key nodes in their infrastructure. "They rule through bureaucracy, through established procedures, through the assumption that everyone will follow the rules. But what happens when someone doesn't? What happens when your enemy refuses to play the game?" President Vasquez had been silent through most of the debate, listening to arguments from both sides while the weight of 8 billion lives pressed down on her shoulders. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd climbed from the slums of Neo Francisco to the highest office in human space through sheer determination. When she finally spoke, her voice carried across the chamber with the force of absolute conviction. "The Council thinks they know us," she began, rising from her seat to address the assembled representatives directly. "They've studied our history, analyzed our behavior, predicted our response with their computers and algorithms. They see the American Revolution, the French Resistance, the liberation wars of the 22nd century, and they think they understand human warfare. They see our emotional attachments to concepts like freedom and justice, and they interpret these as weaknesses to be exploited." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing with growing intensity. "They're wrong. Dead wrong. Because they've made the same mistake that tyrants have been making since the dawn of civilization. They've confused compliance with consent, submission with peace. They think that because most species eventually bow to superior force, all species will. They think that because their way has worked for millennia, it will always work." The president activated her own display, showing not military assets or territorial boundaries, but something far more dangerous to established order: historical precedents. Images flashed across the screen. Vietnamese farmers defeating the Yao, world's most advanced military, Afghan tribesmen outlasting 3 separate superpowers, colonial insurgents toppling an empire on which the sun never set. Every one of these conflicts had the same pattern, President Vasquez explained, her voice growing stronger with each word. A technologically superior force assumes that superior firepower guarantees victory. They plan for conventional warfare. Traditional tactics, opponents who will stand and fight according to established rules. But asymmetric warfare isn't about matching the enemy's strength. It's about attacking their weaknesses while avoiding their advantages entirely. The debate shifted as representatives began to understand what their president was suggesting. This wouldn't be about massing Earth's pathetic fleet against Council dreadnoughts. This wouldn't be about honorable combat or glorious last stands. This would be something far more dangerous to the established order, a reminder of what humans had always been best at: survival through any means necessary. Senator Maria Santos Chen from the industrial worlds raised the question everyone was thinking but few dared voice. Madam President, are you suggesting we abandon the Geneva Conventions, the rules of warfare established after the corporate wars, the ethical guidelines that separate us from common pirates and terrorists? President Vasquez met her gaze steadily, her expression carved from granite. Senator, 47 million of our friends and allies are dead, murdered in their sleep during their most sacred festival. The Council didn't follow any rules when they committed genocide. They didn't show mercy to Valoran children, respect for Valoran traditions, or restraint in their slaughter. They want us to kneel, to accept that might makes right, to agree that 8 billion human lives are worth less than their convenience. She stood silent for a moment, letting the weight of that statement settle over the chamber. When she spoke again, her words would be remembered throughout human history as the moment our species chose to bare its fangs rather than bow its head. The vote before us isn't about whether to fight. We're already at war, whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is whether we'll fight their war by their rules according to their expectations, or whether we'll fight our war the way humans have always fought when our survival was at stake. Total war. No prisoners, no mercy, no quarter asked or given. We're going to remind the galaxy why Earth is classified as a death world. The vote was unanimous, not because Congress was bloodthirsty, but because sometimes the only way to preserve civilization is to become temporarily uncivilized. Within hours of the declaration, every human military and civilian asset throughout the 17 systems received the same coded transmission. The children are crying. Time to remind the monsters why we keep the lights on. Admiral James Reginald, a grizzled veteran whose career had spanned everything from pirate suppression to first contact protocols, found himself commanding humanity's response to genocidal aliens with the same methodical precision he'd once used to plan supply runs. Standing before his staff in the war room beneath Titan Base, he looked like what he was, a career military officer who'd spent decades preparing for wars he'd hoped would never come. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of tactical displays showing enemy positions throughout the galaxy. "Effective immediately, we are no longer bound by the Geneva Conventions, the Valoran codes of combat, or the Council's rules of engagement. We're not fighting a war of conquest or territorial expansion. We're not trying to liberate oppressed populations or spread democracy through the galaxy. We have exactly one objective: kill them all." The plan that emerged from those initial strategy sessions would have horrified the Council's military analysts, if they'd been able to comprehend it. Operation Ghost Protocol wasn't designed around the traditional military concepts of force concentration, strategic objectives, or territorial control. Instead, it was built on principles that human strategists had perfected during centuries of asymmetric warfare: maximum disruption through minimum exposure, systematic degradation of enemy capabilities, and the psychological warfare value of unpredictability. Dr. Elizabeth Morton, Earth's leading expert in xenological warfare, and a woman who'd spent her career studying how different species conducted military operations, laid out the operational framework with clinical detachment. "The beauty of the Council's arrogance," she explained to the assembled officers, "is that they've never faced an enemy willing to abandon conventional tactics entirely. Their entire military doctrine is built around fleet-to-fleet combat, territorial control, and resource management. They've never had to deal with an opponent who doesn't want to conquer them, just kill them. The first phase targeted something every advanced civilization takes for granted, but rarely thinks to defend: logistics. The Council's vast empire required enormous amounts of resources flowing constantly between systems. Antimatter fuel for their ships, rare elements for their technology, food for species that couldn't synthesize everything they needed, medical supplies for biological entities that could still get sick or injured despite their advanced science. These supply lines had been operating safely for millennia, protected by treaty, tradition, and the simple assumption that no civilized species would attack non-military targets. The Council's merchant fleet consisted of massive, slow-moving vessels that prioritized cargo capacity over maneuverability or defensive systems. They traveled along established hyperspace routes, following schedules that hadn't changed in centuries, protected by nothing more than transponder codes and the galaxy's collective agreement that commerce should remain separate from warfare. Captain Mike Torres, commanding what had once been the mining vessel Broken Promise, but now served as humanity's first stealth raider, typified the new kind of warfare Earth was about to unleash. His ship still looked like a civilian craft on every scanner, because it was. The modifications were internal, invisible, designed not to enhance its combat capabilities but to make it completely forgettable. Fake registration codes, dummy cargo, manifests, even holographic crew members to make inspections appear routine. Target acquired, Admiral, Torres reported from the bridge of his converted miner, watching as a Council supply convoy approached through his passive sensors. 60,000 ships worth of antimatter fuel, food synthesizers for 30 systems, and enough medical supplies to treat a dozen plagues. 3 escort vessels, all running routine patrols. They're not even at combat alert. Admiral Reginald's response came back immediately, carrying the weight of humanity's rage and determination. Paint it, Torres. Make sure their sensors get a good look at human signatures before you light the fuse. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds. Magnetic mines, disguised as navigation beacons and deployed weeks earlier by routine maintenance ships, detonated simultaneously throughout the convoy. The antimatter containers ruptured in a chain reaction that created a temporary star, visible from 3 systems away. The food synthesizers scattered their molecular patterns across light years of empty space. The medical supplies became an expanding cloud of organic compounds that would never heal anyone again. More importantly, the escort vessel's last transmissions clearly identified human energy signatures, human ship configurations, human weapon systems. The Council would know exactly who was responsible, but they wouldn't know how, where, or when the next attack would come. Similar incidents began occurring simultaneously across 47 Council systems, each one carefully planned to cause maximum disruption while providing minimum intelligence about human capabilities or intentions. Supply depots exploded due to industrial accidents that left behind traces of human sabotage devices. Transport ships disappeared in hyperspace. Their automated distress calls cut off mid-transmission in ways that suggested boarding actions rather than mechanical failure. Communication relays suffered technical malfunctions that somehow only affected military frequencies while leaving civilian networks untouched. The pattern was deliberately confusing, designed to keep Council analysts guessing about humanity's actual capabilities and strategic objectives. Some attacks used sophisticated technology that suggested advanced cloaking systems or matter transportation devices. Others relied on crude explosives and kinetic weapons that could have been deployed by any species with basic space travel. Some targets were hit by what appeared to be military strike teams, while others showed signs of insider sabotage or simple mechanical failure. High Counselor Zeth Kara, her crystalline features actually showing stress fractures for the first time in living memory, tried to make sense of the chaos during an emergency session on Nexus Prime. "These cannot be coincidences," she declared, her harmonic voice carrying overtones of confusion and growing anger. 47 separate incidents across 17 sectors in the span of 3 days. Where are the human fleets? Our sensor networks show no significant military movement, no massing of forces, no preparations for conventional assault. The Council's intelligence apparatus refined over millennia of conventional warfare and political maneuvering, found itself completely unable to analyze an enemy that refused to follow established patterns. Their long-range scans showed all major human military assets maintaining defensive positions around Earth and its primary colonies. Either humanity had developed cloaking technology beyond Council comprehension, or they were using assets that hadn't been properly cataloged as military threats. The realization, when it finally came, sent shockwaves through every Council species that still remembered what it felt like to be afraid. The breakthrough came during what should have been a routine intelligence briefing on the fourth day of humanity's invisible war. Thessian collective speaker Velthara, its bioluminescent patterns cycling through configurations that indicated deep analytical processing, presented data that fundamentally changed the Council's understanding of what they were facing. Council members, the artificial voice began, its synthesized tones carrying none of the urgency that the creature's rapidly shifting light patterns suggested. Our intelligence networks have identified a critical oversight in our assessment of human military capabilities. The human commercial fleet consists of approximately 40,000 vessels, mining ships, cargo haulers, colony transports, research vessels, industrial platforms, and various support craft. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. 40,000 ships. Not sleek military vessels designed for combat, but the workhorses of human civilization. Asteroid miners with industrial cutting lasers that could slice through battleship armor. Cargo haulers with magnetic manipulators powerful enough to tear apart space stations. Colony ships with life support systems that could sustain crews for decades in deep space. Korath Intelligence Chief Vexthor, his 6 arms moving in agitated patterns that betrayed his species' growing alarm, expanded on the implications with military precision. These vessels were categorized as non-combatants under standard threat assessment protocols. Industrial, equipment, civilian transportation, research platforms. None were considered potential military assets because they lacked dedicated weapon systems, armor plating, or tactical maneuvering capabilities. But the Korath military mind, trained for millennia in conventional warfare, was beginning to grasp something that should have been obvious from the start. Human civilization wasn't like other species. Most races developed their military and civilian technology separately, with clear distinctions between tools of war and tools of peace. Humans, products of a death world where the line between survival and combat had never been clearly drawn, tended to build everything with dual purposes in mind. An asteroid mining ship, for instance, carried fusion charges powerful enough to crack small moons, magnetic nets capable of containing debris fields the size of cities, and industrial fabrication systems that could manufacture anything from spare parts to nuclear weapons given sufficient time and raw materials. None of these systems were weapons in the traditional sense, but in human hands the distinction became meaningless. High Counselor Zeth Kara's crystalline features flickered with patterns that indicated computational overload as she tried to process the strategic implications. You are suggesting that humanity has effectively militarized their entire civilian infrastructure? That every cargo ship is a potential warship, every mining operation a weapons factory, every research station an intelligence gathering post? The answer came not from Council intelligence services, but from intercepted human communications that painted a picture of coordinated civilian mobilization unprecedented in galactic history. Merchant captains who'd spent decades hauling supplies between colonies were receiving encrypted orders to deliver packages to specific coordinates in Council space. Research vessels that had been exploring dead systems were suddenly changing course toward major shipping lanes. Even tourist ships, those floating hotels that carried wealthy humans on sightseeing tours of exotic worlds, were being retrofitted with equipment that had no obvious recreational purpose. Captain Elena Rodriguez, commanding the converted luxury liner Stellar Dreams, exemplified this transformation in a transmission that Council cryptographers hadn't been meant to intercept. Her ship had originally been designed to carry 5,000 passengers on comfortable tours of the galaxy's wonders. Now it carried 5,000 volunteers, engineers, hackers, demolition experts, former military personnel who'd been enjoying retirement until their old enemies murdered their allies. Admiral, we've reached the Centauri shipping nexus. Rodriguez reported, her voice carrying the casual professionalism of someone discussing routine cargo operations rather than acts of war. The modifications are complete. We're reading as a standard tourist vessel on all frequencies, complete with holographic passengers enjoying the scenic views. The council patrol that inspected us 3 hours ago even recommended some local restaurants. What the council patrol hadn't detected were the 30,000 magnetic mines now distributed throughout their cargo bays, each one programmed to attach itself to passing ships and detonate on a timer, or the signal jammers that would disrupt communications throughout the system when activated, or the 5,000 human volunteers who were about to demonstrate why their species had earned the nickname Persistence Predators. The Stellar Dreams was just one example of humanity's approach to total war. The converted research vessel Scientific Method had spent the last week mapping council military installations while masquerading as an archaeological expedition. The cargo hauler Honest Work was delivering something other than trade goods to a dozen council worlds, leaving behind gifts that would keep giving long after the ship departed. The mining platform Deep Digger had discovered new deposits, all right. Deposits of nuclear warheads buried beneath major population centers. Dr. Morton, monitoring these operations from her command center deep beneath Luna City, watched the strategic picture develop with the satisfaction of someone seeing a complex plan come together. Phase 2 is now in effect, she announced to Admiral Reginald and his staff. The Council's attempting to identify and intercept our military assets while 40,000 civilian vessels operate freely throughout their territory. They're looking for wolves while being circled by sheep who've decided to show their teeth. The psychological effect was already becoming apparent in intercepted council communications. Military commanders who'd spent centuries dealing with predictable opponents were finding themselves paralyzed by an enemy they couldn't identify, couldn't locate, couldn't predict. Every human ship now represented a potential threat. Every routine cargo delivery could be carrying death. Every research expedition might be gathering intelligence for future attacks. More devastating than the physical damage was the growing realization that humanity had turned the Council's greatest strength, their vast interconnected empire, into their greatest vulnerability. Every supply line was now a target. Every communication relay could be compromised. Every civilian area that had enjoyed millennia of peace was suddenly a potential battlefield. The Council's military doctrine, refined over thousands of years, was based on the assumption that enemies would present themselves for battle, that wars would be fought between clearly identified military forces according to established rules. They had massive fleets, impregnable fortresses, weapons that could crack planets. But all of that firepower was useless against an enemy that refused to present targets, that struck from the shadows and vanished before retaliation could be organized. Worse yet, humanity's civilian fleet wasn't just larger than the Council had realized, it was more capable. These weren't luxury cruise ships and simple cargo haulers, but the vessels of a species that had colonized hostile environments throughout 17 star systems. Every ship was built to survive in the void, to operate independently for extended periods, to repair itself and adapt to changing conditions. They were, in essence, a 40,000 ship navy that didn't look like a navy and didn't act like a navy, but was perfectly capable of bringing civilization to its knees. By the end of the first week, panic was spreading through Council territory, faster than their quantum communication networks could carry official reassurances. The attacks weren't random anymore. They were escalating, becoming more sophisticated, more personal, more psychologically devastating with each passing day. The turning point came when the Council's most secure research facility, hidden in the Arcturus system and supposedly known only to the highest levels of government, simply vanished. Not destroyed, not damaged, vanished. One day it was there, a massive orbital platform conducting classified weapons research that could have tipped the balance of power in the galaxy. The next day there was nothing but empty space and confused patrol ships wondering where their assignment had gone. The facility's disappearance was impossible by every law of physics the Council understood. Structures that size couldn't be moved without massive fleets and months of preparation. They couldn't be destroyed without leaving debris fields. They couldn't be hidden by any known cloaking technology. Yet somehow 30,000 researchers, a trillion credit facility, and decades of irreplaceable research had been erased from existence overnight. What made it worse was the message left behind, broadcast on every frequency in the system. The Valorans always said that true strength comes from protecting the innocent, not exploiting the helpless. Consider this a practical demonstration. The management. The transmission was traced to 17 different sources simultaneously, each one leading to a different dead end in human commercial traffic. Council intelligence services, already strained by the need to investigate thousands of routine incidents across their territory, found themselves completely overwhelmed by the implications. If humans could make a research station disappear, what else could they do? How many of their facilities were already compromised? How many of their secrets were no longer secret? High Counselor Zethkara called another emergency session, her crystalline features now showing stress fractures that ran deep enough to affect her structural integrity. The assembled representatives of the 12 council races looked like what they were: ancient beings who had grown comfortable with their power and were now discovering what it felt like to be afraid. The human attacks have escalated beyond acceptable parameters, she announced, her harmonic voice carrying overtones of something the council hadn't heard in millennia: uncertainty. Intelligence reports indicate coordinated operations across 47 systems, with casualty rates and economic damage exceeding worst-case projections. We are facing an enemy that appears to be everywhere and nowhere, capable of striking at any target regardless of security measures. The Nexari representative, a silicon-based entity whose geological timescale perspective usually made it the voice of patience and long-term thinking, spoke with uncharacteristic urgency. This species operates outside our understanding of warfare. They do not seek territory, resources, or political advantage. Their objectives appear to be purely destructive, focused on maximizing damage to our infrastructure while avoiding direct confrontation. But it was the Vorthak Consortium's hive mind delegate that identified the true scope of the threat they were facing. Speaking through its cybernetic interface in the flat, emotionless tones of collective consciousness, it delivered an assessment that sent chills through even the most ancient council members. Analysis of human attack patterns indicates systematic targeting of psychological as well as strategic objectives. They are not attempting to defeat our military forces through superior firepower. They are attempting to destroy our confidence in our own security, our trust in our own systems, our belief in our own invincibility. This is not warfare as we understand it. This is terror. The word hung in the chamber like a death sentence. Terror. The council races had been so advanced, so civilized for so long, that they'd forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely afraid. Their wars had been formal affairs, conducted according to rules that limited casualties and minimized psychological trauma. Even their most violent conflicts had been restrained by mutual understanding that civilization depended on maintaining certain boundaries. Humanity wasn't respecting those boundaries. Worse, they were demonstrating that the boundaries had never been real, just mutual agreements that could be abandoned whenever someone decided the stakes were high enough. The comfortable assumption that advanced societies would always fight civilized wars was crumbling along with the Council's sense of security. The reports kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. A Thessian medical facility treating civilian casualties from the initial attacks had been infiltrated by what appeared to be maintenance workers. The facility's quantum computers had been infected with a virus that caused them to display holographic images of Valoran children at random intervals, children who had died in the massacre, their faces now haunting the doctors who were trying to save lives. A Korath military academy, where the Empire's future officers learned the arts of honorable warfare, discovered that their training simulations had been compromised. Instead of facing traditional opponents in carefully designed scenarios, cadets found themselves fighting phantom human ships that used tactics no civilized species would consider: ramming attacks, suicide bombings, the use of civilian casualties as psychological weapons, methods that violated every principle of military honor the Korath held sacred. Most disturbing of all was what happened to the Zephyrian Council archives on their homeworld. The crystalline beings prided themselves on perfect record-keeping, maintaining detailed histories of galactic civilization that stretched back millions of years. One morning, archivists arrived to find that significant portions of their records had been altered. Not destroyed, not stolen, edited. Every reference to Valoran contributions to galactic civilization had been enhanced, expanded, turned into monuments to their memory. The dry historical records had been transformed into passionate testimonials about Valoran courage, Valoran sacrifice, Valoran dedication to protecting the innocent. Most unnervingly, the edits were written in perfect Zephyrian harmonic script, using literary techniques and cultural references that only a master of their language could have employed. The message was clear. Humans had penetrated even their most secure facilities, had access to their most protected systems, could reach them anywhere, anytime, in ways they couldn't predict or prevent. But instead of stealing state secrets or causing immediate damage, they'd chosen to create memorials to the dead, reminders of why this war had started, monuments to the species the Council had murdered in their sleep. Dr. Morton, Monitoring Council, communications from her command center, allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction as the reports flowed in. Phase 3 is exceeding expectations, she reported to Admiral Reginald. The Council is beginning to understand that this isn't about military victory or strategic objectives. This is about making them pay for what they did, one nightmare at a time. The Admiral nodded grimly, his weathered features reflecting decades of hard decisions. Good. Let them remember what it feels like to be helpless. Let them understand what those Valoran children felt when the bombs started falling. Let them learn that some things are worse than death, like living with the knowledge that your victims are still out there, still fighting, still making you pay for your crimes. 3 weeks into humanity's invisible war, the Galactic Council was facing something unprecedented in their millennia of existence: the complete breakdown of their authority. What had begun as targeted strikes against military and industrial assets had evolved into a campaign of psychological warfare that was tearing apart the very fabric of their civilization. The Council's emergency session on day 21 brought together representatives who looked nothing like the confident rulers who had ordered the Valoran massacre. Zethkara's crystalline structure now showed fractures throughout her core matrix, stress patterns that indicated her species' equivalent of a nervous breakdown. The Korath Battlelord's normally perfect posture had deteriorated into the aggressive slouch of a warrior who couldn't identify his enemy. Even the Thessian Collective's emotionless speaker showed signs of distress, its bioluminescent patterns flickering erratically as competing analysis algorithms fought for processing priority. The situation has deteriorated beyond all projections, Zethkara announced, her harmonic voice now carrying discordant overtones that hurt to listen to. Economic damage exceeds 2 trillion credits and continues to accelerate. Military effectiveness has decreased by 40% due to resource shortages and personnel reassignments to security duties. Civilian confidence in Council protection has reached historic lows. But the numbers, devastating as they were, didn't capture the true scope of what humanity had accomplished. The Council's greatest strength had always been their image of invincible authority. For thousands of years, younger species had looked to them as the ultimate arbiters of galactic law, the final authority on matters of civilization and order. That image was now crumbling as reports spread of their inability to protect even their most secure installations. The Helian Empire's representative, normally the most composed of the Council members, delivered a report that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Our intelligence services have identified over 3,000 separate incidents attributable to human action. Yet we have successfully intercepted fewer than 50 human operatives, and those only through random chance rather than systematic counterintelligence. We are facing an enemy that appears to have unlimited resources, perfect intelligence, and the ability to strike any target at any time. What made the situation even more intolerable was the growing realization that humanity wasn't trying to conquer Council territory or replace their government. A conventional enemy could be understood, negotiated with, eventually defeated through superior force or strategic maneuvering, but humans seemed interested only in causing pain, in making the Council suffer for their actions, in demonstrating that their victims could strike back from beyond the grave. The psychological warfare campaign had reached levels of sophistication that bordered on the supernatural. Council officials found personal messages waiting in their private quarters, written in languages only they knew, referencing conversations only they remembered, signed with the names of Valoran friends they'd thought long forgotten. Military commanders discovered their tactical computers had been programmed to display holographic recreations of the Festival of Unity, complete with images of Valoran families enjoying their last moments of peace. Most unnervingly, the attacks were becoming personal, targeted not just at Council infrastructure, but at the individuals who had planned and executed the massacre. High Counselor Zethkara herself had awakened one morning to find her private garden, a crystal formation that had taken centuries to cultivate, rearranged into a memorial for Valoran children. Each crystal had been carved with a name, a face, a brief description of dreams that would never be realized. The message had been accompanied by a note in perfect Zephyrian script. They had gardens too. They had children who played among crystal formations just like yours. They had futures that you stole from them. Now they're part of your garden forever. Sleep well. A friend. Similar incidents were occurring throughout Council space. The Korath Battlelord found his personal weapons collection replaced with Valoran ceremonial swords, each one inscribed with the name of a warrior who had died during the festival. The Thessian collective discovered their collective consciousness network had been infiltrated with memories that weren't theirs, memories of Valoran philosophers discussing ethics, Valoran artists creating beauty, Valoran parents tucking their children into bed for the last time. But it was the Nexari representative who delivered the assessment that finally forced the Council to confront the magnitude of their miscalculation. Speaking in the slow, measured tones of a species that thought in geological timescales, it presented an analysis that cut through political posturing and military bravado to reveal an uncomfortable truth. This council has existed for 4,000 years, it began, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. We have survived the collapse of stellar empires, the extinction of entire species, wars that consumed solar systems. We have endured because we understood the rules of power, the calculations of force, the mathematics of survival. But these humans, they are not playing by any rules we recognize. The ancient being paused, its silicon-based form shifting subtly as it processed concepts that challenged its fundamental understanding of civilization. They do not seek to replace our authority. They seek to destroy our credibility. They do not want our territory. They want our suffering. They do not fight to win. They fight to ensure we lose. This is not warfare as rational beings conduct it. This is vengeance elevated to an art form. The council chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Every one of their standard responses, negotiation, escalation, overwhelming force, was useless against an enemy whose only objective was making them pay for their crimes. You couldn't negotiate with someone who wanted nothing from you except your pain. You couldn't escalate against an enemy who was already fighting with maximum intensity. You couldn't overwhelm forces that refused to present themselves for battle. Korath, Battlelord Thexnox, his 6 arms clenched in patterns that indicated barely controlled fury, voiced what they were all thinking. What do they want from us? What will make them stop? The answer came not from Council Intelligence Services or Diplomatic Corps, but from an intercepted human transmission that had been broadcast on every frequency in the galaxy. The voice belonged to Admiral Reginald, speaking not as a military commander but as the representative of a species pushed beyond the breaking point. Members of the Galactic Council, the transmission began, each word carrying the weight of righteous anger and implacable determination. You asked what we want. The answer is simple. We want you to remember. Remember the children who died during the Festival of Unity. Remember the families you murdered in their sleep. Remember that when you decided to teach the galaxy a lesson about knowing its place, you chose the wrong species to make an example of. The transmission continued with clinical precision, describing in detail the evidence humanity had gathered of Council war crimes, the documentation of their systematic violation of every treaty and principle they claim to uphold, the proof of their calculated genocide against an innocent population. We're not interested in your surrender, your negotiations, or your promises of reform. Admiral Reginald's voice continued. We're interested in justice. And justice, as the Valorans taught us, sometimes requires that the guilty suffer for their crimes. You wanted to demonstrate the consequences of defying council authority. Consider this our demonstration of what happens when you murder our friends. Desperation drives even the wisest beings to foolish decisions, and the Galactic Council was no exception. 6 weeks into humanity's campaign of systematic revenge, with their authority crumbling and their territories in chaos, they made the choice that would seal their fate forever. The decision came during what would be their final emergency session, held not in their crystal spires on Nexus Prime, but in a secure bunker deep beneath the planet's surface. The once mighty rulers of the galaxy huddled in reinforced chambers, surrounded by defensive systems that had failed to stop human infiltrators from leaving flowers on their conference table. White roses, the traditional Valoran symbol of mourning, each one tagged with the name of a murdered child. High Counselor Zethkara, her crystalline form now held together more by force of will than structural integrity, delivered the proposal that would become known as the Omega Protocol. Her voice, once harmonious and confident, now carried the desperate undertones of someone who had run out of rational options. Fellow council members, conventional responses have proven ineffective against human tactics. Their refusal to present legitimate military targets combined with their apparent ability to infiltrate any installation, regardless of security measures, has made traditional warfare impossible. Therefore, I propose we implement the final solution protocols developed during the Andromeda Rebellion. The silence that followed was profound. The Omega Protocol had been designed as the ultimate deterrent, a weapon so terrible that its very existence was supposed to prevent anyone from pushing the Council beyond acceptable limits. It was genocide on an industrial scale, the systematic sterilization of entire solar systems through coordinated deployment of planet-killing weapons. The Nexari representative, ancient even by Council standards, spoke first with the slow precision of someone choosing their words very carefully. High Counselor, the Omega Protocol has never been deployed against a spacefaring civilization. Its use would constitute the largest act of xenocide in galactic history, exceeding even our actions against the Valorans by several orders of magnitude. But desperation had made the Council deaf to reason, blind to consequences beyond their immediate survival. Battlelord Thexnox slammed 4 of his 6 arms against the conference table, his species' equivalent of enthusiastic agreement. The humans have demonstrated that they cannot be contained through conventional means. They have shown no interest in negotiation or surrender. If we cannot defeat them through military action, we must eliminate them through overwhelming force. The debate that followed would have been academic under normal circumstances, a discussion of theoretical scenarios that civilized beings hoped never to face. But these were not normal circumstances, and the Council was no longer civilized in any meaningful sense. Fear had stripped away millennia of cultural evolution, revealing the primitive tribal instincts that lurked beneath their advanced facades. The vote was closer than it should have been. 7 races in favor, 5 opposed. But the result was never really in doubt. The Council had painted themselves into a corner where genocide seemed like the only viable option, where the complete extinction of humanity appeared preferable to admitting they had been wrong to massacre the Valorans. The Omega Protocol called for the simultaneous deployment of stellar cascade weapons against all 17 human solar systems. These devices, banned by every treaty and hidden in the deepest Council vaults, were designed to destabilize stars themselves, turning them into supernovas that would sterilize everything within dozens of light years. 8 billion humans would die, along with every other form of life in their territories. But the Council would finally have peace. What they didn't know was that humanity had been expecting this decision for weeks. Dr. Morton's analysis of Council psychology had predicted their escalation to genocide with disturbing accuracy. and preparations had been underway since the beginning of the campaign. When the Omega Protocol deployment orders were issued, human intelligence networks throughout Council space were ready. Captain Sarah Chen, now commanding a battle group of converted merchant vessels, received her final orders while maintaining position in the supposedly empty void between Council systems. Her ships looked like debris on Council sensors, the wreckage of destroyed human vessels that had been written off weeks earlier. In reality, they were perfectly functional warships hiding among their own fake corpses, waiting for the moment when the Council would reveal the location of their ultimate weapons. All Ghost units, this is Control, came Dr. Morton's voice through quantum-encrypted channels that the Council still hadn't learned to intercept. The Council has authorized Omega Protocol deployment. Repeat, they're going for the planet killers. Light them up. What happened next would be remembered as the Battle of 7 Minutes, though battle was perhaps too generous a term for what was essentially a coordinated execution. The Council's stellar cascade weapons, hidden in fortified installations, throughout their core territories had been designed to be undetectable and invulnerable. They were protected by the most advanced defensive systems in the galaxy, staffed by elite personnel who had trained their entire careers for this moment. None of that mattered, because humanity had been inside their security perimeter for weeks. The installations didn't explode or collapse or suffer dramatic deaths worthy of entertainment programs. They simply stopped working, their quantum processors infected with viruses that turned their targeting computers into holographic displays showing Valoran children at play. Their stellar cascade devices, capable of destroying stars, found themselves reprogrammed to broadcast poetry, Valoran verses about courage, honor, and the importance of protecting the innocent. Admiral Reginald, monitoring the operation from his command center, allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction as the reports came in. 17 installation sites, 17 critical failures, 17 demonstrations that the Council's ultimate weapons were no more secure than anything else they'd tried to use against humanity. But the real message wasn't in the failure of their weapons, it was in what humanity chose to do with them. Instead of destroying the installations, instead of turning the Council's planet killers against their own worlds, humans did something that no Council strategist had predicted. They broadcast the locations, specifications, and control codes for every Omega Protocol weapon to every species in the galaxy. Attention, citizens of the galaxy, came President Vasquez's voice on every communication frequency, carried by quantum relay to every inhabited system within 1,000 light-years. For your information and protection, we are releasing complete technical specifications for the Council's stellar cascade weapons, including their current locations and operational status. These devices are capable of destroying entire solar systems and have been deployed with the intention of committing xenocide against humanity. The broadcast continued with clinical precision, detailing not just the weapons, but the decision-making process that had led to their deployment. The Council's discussions of genocide, their casual dismissal of the billions of lives they intended to extinguish. We could destroy these weapons, the President continued, her voice carrying across the galaxy to species that had never heard of Earth, but were now learning what happened when you murdered human allies. We could turn them against Council worlds, give them a taste of the terror they intended to inflict on us. But we're not the Galactic Council. We don't commit genocide, even against our enemies. Instead, we're giving this information to you, the citizens they've been ruling through fear and intimidation, so you can decide for yourselves what kind of leaders you want. The galaxy's response to humanity's revelation was swift, decisive, and utterly devastating to what remained of Council authority. Within hours of President Vasquez's broadcast, species that had been subjugated for millennia were rising against their oppressors with a fury that made humanity's campaign look restrained by comparison. The Altarian Collective, silicon-based, beings who had been forced to mine toxic minerals for Council use, shut down every industrial facility in their territory simultaneously. The Rigel Commonwealth, whose shipping lanes had been controlled by Council tariffs for centuries, declared independence and began seizing Council vessels. Most dramatically, the Centauri Federation, longtime Council allies who had participated in the Valoran massacre, turned their fleets against their former partners with the zeal of converts seeking redemption. But it was the younger species, the ones like humanity who had been kept on the periphery of galactic civilization, who responded with the greatest enthusiasm to the Council's exposed weakness. The Draconian Empire, reptilian beings whose honor, codes rivaled those of the Valorans, declared a holy war against the murderers of children. The aquatic minds of the Delphine Nebula, previously peaceful beings who communicated through song, began broadcasting psychic warfare frequencies that drove Council telepaths to madness. High Counselor Zethkara, her crystalline form now more cracked than substance, tried to address the galaxy one final time from her bunker deep beneath Nexus Prime. The transmission was interrupted 17 times by human hackers, each interruption replacing her image with holographs of Valoran families, celebrating their final festival of unity. "Citizens of the galaxy," she began, her once harmonious voice now a discordant screech of desperation and fury. "Do not be deceived by human propaganda. The Omega Protocol was developed as a defensive measure, a deterrent against species that refuse to accept civilized authority. The humans have proven themselves to be a threat to galactic stability, a cancer that must be excised before it spreads." The response came not from official government channels but from Captain Elena Rodriguez, broadcasting from the bridge of the Stellar Dreams as it orbited Nexus Prime itself. Her converted luxury liner, still displaying holographic tourists enjoying the scenic views, had somehow penetrated the Council's most heavily defended system without triggering a single alarm. "Council members," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who held all the cards. "You seem to be under the impression that this is still your galaxy to rule. Let me correct that misunderstanding." What followed was a demonstration of human capabilities that finally, definitively, ended the Council's illusions about their own security. The Stellar Dreams didn't attack Nexus Prime. It did something far worse. It began broadcasting live video feeds from inside Council facilities, showing the galaxy exactly how their supposed leaders lived while their subjects suffered. The crystal spires that had symbolized Council authority for millennia were revealed to be monuments to excess and cruelty. Vast chambers filled with stolen artwork from destroyed civilizations, luxury apartments where Council members enjoyed delicacies made from the processed remains of extinct species. Most damning of all, archives containing detailed records of every genocide, every war crime, every act of calculated cruelty the Council had perpetrated over their 4,000 years of rule. "This is what your leaders do with their power," Rodriguez continued, her cameras panning across rooms full of horrors that defied description. "This is what they consider civilization, and this is what they were willing to destroy 17 solar systems to protect." The final revelation came when human infiltrators activated the Council's own historical archives, broadcasting millennia of classified records that exposed the true scope of their crimes. The galaxy learned about the Valorans, yes, but also about hundreds of other species that had been quietly exterminated when they became inconvenient, about worlds stripped of resources and left to die, about entire civilizations erased from history because they had dared to question Council authority. Species throughout the galaxy watched in growing horror as the evidence mounted. The Council hadn't been maintaining order. They had been maintaining control through systematic terror, genocide, and the careful cultivation of ignorance among their subjects. The peaceful, stable civilization they claimed to protect was built on a foundation of bones. Admiral Reginald, monitoring the galactic response from Earth, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as rebellion erupted across Council territory. Fleets that had served the Council for centuries turned their weapons against their former masters. Colonies declared independence en masse. Even species that had been members of the Council itself began abandoning Nexus Prime as their populations learned the truth about their leaders' actions. "All ghost units, this is command," he broadcast to the human forces scattered throughout the galaxy. "Mission accomplished. The Council is finished as a political entity. Begin Phase 4, humanitarian assistance and reconstruction support for liberated territories." But humanity's final message to the galaxy came not from military commanders or political leaders, but from the survivors of Valoran Prime. A handful of refugees who had escaped the massacre now stood before the ruins of their homeworld, broadcasting a memorial service that was carried to every inhabited system in the galaxy. Ambassador Kethvar Ironspirit, the Valoran diplomat who had first vouched for humanity before the council, was among the dead. But his daughter, Sahavara, Brightblade, had survived the massacre and now spoke for her people with the quiet dignity that had always characterized their species. "People of the galaxy," she began, her words translated into thousands of languages but carrying the same weight of grief and determination in all of them. "My people are gone, murdered in their sleep by those who claimed to represent civilization and order. But their deaths were not meaningless, because they revealed the truth about our oppressors to those with the courage to act on that knowledge." She paused, looking directly into the cameras that were broadcasting her words to species she had never met on worlds she had never seen. "The humans call this justice, and perhaps it is, but I call it something else. Hope. Hope that the galaxy's future will be different from its past. Hope that courage and honor still matter. Hope that sometimes when evil seems triumphant, there are still those willing to stand up and say, 'No more.'" The memorial service concluded with a traditional Valoran ceremony of remembrance, performed not by their own people, but by humans who had learned their rituals and adopted their customs as a way of honoring the dead. As 8 billion human voices rose in a song of mourning that had been old when Earth was young, species throughout the galaxy began to understand what the Council had really destroyed when they murdered the Valorans. They had destroyed the galaxy's conscience. But in doing so, they had awakened humanity's wrath, and humanity had proven to be a very effective substitute for justice. The Galactic Council was finished. Their empire was in ruins. Their authority was broken beyond repair. And throughout the galaxy, species that had been oppressed for millennia were finally free to determine their own destinies. The Valorans were gone, but they were not forgotten. And the galaxy would be a better place, because humans remembered how to fight for those who could no longer fight for themselves, in memory of those who stood against the darkness, and those who carry their light forward.